Trust, Humanity and Inclusion, MAG, and Norwegian People's Aid. And we're really pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the second version of the Standardising Beneficiary Definitions Guide. I'm really pleased, by way of introduction, that the UK has been asked to moderate this event. We were involved in the very sort of early ideas around a standard beneficiary document. It was originally developed by the Mines Advisory Group, the Halo Trust, and Norwegian People's Aid, who were the three members of the consortium delivering the UK's first global mine action programme. And it became apparent during that programme that all of our delivery partners were counting beneficiaries in different ways across different organisations and across different countries. And so the then UK Department for International Development asked our partners to standardise their approach. And this would make it possible to measure the benefits of mine action more accurately and effectively across the piece. So the first edition of the standardised definitions was published in November 2016. And it's been really encouraging to see from those sort of small beginnings in the first phase of the Global Mine Action Programme, how this has really grown. And I think what's been most encouraging to us has been to see how partners themselves have taken a lead on developing and updating the definitions. And also on how inclusive this work has been. While it was those three organisations to begin with, there are 7 organisations now involved in this second phase, but so many more have been involved in consultations, in discussions on the definitions. I'd particularly like to mention GICHD, the International Committee of the Red Cross, UNDP, UNICEF, and UNMAS from the UN family. All these and many more have been involved in coordinating and consulting on these, and I think the result is all the better for that. So this new edition, I think, is a really big step forward in helping us to understand the impact of mine action and in aligning the way that impact is measured across the sector. And I think it's particularly important for us as a donor for mine action, and I think for many donors to mine action, to have a common set of principles, a common set of understandings to help us measure the impact of the investment we're making in mine action. And I think particularly the focus on data, I think we'll hear more about disaggregated data during the session, is really important. And for us, I think a big step forward for this edition is collecting data on people with disabilities, because obviously this is a really important group to be aware of. I guess the final thing I'd say by way of introduction is that one of the strengths of the mine action sector, I think, is this drive to collaborate and to harmonise, and I think this understanding in the mine action sector that working together we can have better impact, and we can work more effectively across the sector. And of course, the gold standard of this approach is the International Mine Action Standards, IMAS. These definitions in this second edition, I think, are a really strong example of that sort of collaboration and that partnering in the sector. And we really hope that these definitions will go on to be formalised and mainstreamed into the IMAS, and that will really sort of consolidate their impact. And so part of the objective of today's session, apart from firstly hearing more about the definitions themselves and the process of consultation that's led to them, but also getting your feedback as practitioners, what you want to see in this work. But we also hope that this will inspire donors, operators, and national authorities to start using these definitions, to start integrating them into your work, and in due course to support their inclusion into IMAS, so they can really take their place as part of the international framework for mine action. So I'm really pleased and proud to be able to moderate this session and to present this work. Before we get into the session, I'd just like to give a few housekeeping points. I think we're all now used to how these sessions work using these new tools, but of course we're using MS Teams today. I should just say right at the beginning that the event is being recorded for posterity. Please, everybody online, do mute if you're not speaking. We're going to have a couple of opportunities for questions and answers. We'll take the presentations in 3 chunks, and there'll be opportunities for questions after each of those chunks. If you'd like to ask a question, please at any point do put your name and your organisation in the chat, and that will give me the signal that you'd like to take the floor when we next have the opportunity. If you don't particularly want to take the floor, but you have a question that you want to ask, please do put the question in the chat and I can read it out. Otherwise, as I say, just put your name and your organisation and I will give you the floor to ask your question yourself. Finally, for those who would like to use it, there is a live caption function. So if you'd like to use the live captions, if you click the 3 dots on the toolbar in the middle of your screen, the menu there will have an option of using live captions if that would be helpful to you. So I think that's probably quite enough from me by way of introduction, and we will get into the discussion. So I'm very pleased, first of all, to be able to give the floor to Charles Frisby of Norwegian People's Aid, and he's going to give us a presentation of the background, purpose and principles of this work. Charles is a global advisor at NPA with more than 20 years of professional experience in international settings from the British Army, from the humanitarian sector and from the UN. So I'm very pleased now to give the floor to Charles to set the scene for us.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador, and good morning to everybody in your respective time zones. We are just loading up a presentation, so please bear with us. I should say that the Ambassador has covered quite a lot of what I can say, so I'll be fairly short. And thank you, as the Ambassador said, for this this strong audience today. Christina, could I kindly ask you to load up the presentation? Great. Thank you, Christina. I will expand, I think, on many of the things that the Ambassador has said. If you could go back to the first slide, please, Christina. The first one, yeah. There are 7 international NGOs there that you can see. We're very conscious that's a particular, grouping. And the Ambassador mentioned that we have had good consultations with other partners along the way, but it's really important now. We very much hope that this is embraced more widely. In that sense, we're very pleased to have the participation today of Deputy Secretary General Panaret from the Cambodian Mine Action Authority, and also Dr. Gonçalves from CNIDA in Angola. So this is definitely where we want this to go, further consultations as required. The picture you can see is actually from Angola in a community where Halo Trust have been working. Next slide, please. It's about partnership and standardization. Inevitably, partnerships do encourage and to some degree demand standardization. Partnerships amongst ourselves, partnerships with donors, partnerships with national authorities, and perhaps most importantly, partnership with the communities where we're working. Beneficiary monitoring is part of this. Our data collection methods. We do share lessons and want to share lessons as we go along. We want to share information. We can think about how we analyze data. And in the course of our work, we do try to improve our indicators as we go along. Next slide, please. An example of one of our current indicators is shown, and it's the percentage of direct beneficiaries surveyed reporting improved access to services and infrastructure, brackets SADDD, that bit will be explained. So this one obviously is about land release. That throws up a number of related questions. This is very much where our information management colleagues have their part to play. How and when do we collect the data? Where? How do we define change, in particular before and after a given intervention? How do we analyse the data and report on outcomes, remembering that outcomes can be a little bit harder to get hold of sometimes? What is the related time period? And can we use this indicator across different donors and countries? Ideally, we can, yes, that's generally what we aim for. Okay, next slide, please. The background, I think, has been covered largely by the ambassador. Initially, based on efforts by MAG, HALO and NPA back in 2016, version 1 was produced. Since then, we have definitely expanded the work and the efforts with those NGOs that are listed, and certainly those partner institutions that are listed, and we very much appreciated their assistance on this and their technical input and their wider understanding of things. Okay, next slide. The purpose is to standardise definitions and guidelines for the measuring, recording and reporting of beneficiary numbers for those 4 thematic areas that you can see: explosive ordnance risk education, land release, victim assistance and explosive ordnance disposal. The 2 new ones there are victim assistance and explosive ordnance disposal, and I'd like to think that that is one of our successes in these efforts to get hold of those thematic topics. We have not yet had a go at stockpile management, stockpile destruction, which of course is actually quite a big part of our work, including physical security and stockpile management, weapons, ammunition management, arms management and destruction. We all know what that is. We will probably have a go at that year ahead, building on the principles of this work. We do want to highlight that the guidelines are disaggregating for sex, age and disability. That's the SADDD bit, and that's very important. That's really what we want to convey, one of the most important things we want to convey today. There will be translation into local languages, and to some degree that has commenced. But of course, we will need to be careful to be accurate on that to make sure that we are, that we're careful with translation. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'll just run through the principles. We want the definitions to be as realistic as possible. We want to avoid inflated figures. Second, we want these efforts to be commensurate in time and resources. We don't want this to be, an overly burdensome exercise. Absolutely not. And if that is happening in any way, we would expect all concerned to feed that back and say, this bit isn't working. Number 3, we want transparency. This relates to accountability. Transparency with all concerned. That I hope would be a benefit to this and reinforce accountability. Number 4, it may be the case that there are some specifics to given contexts, and there is, of course, some space for that. Next slide, please. Number 5, we do anticipate a degree of sort of in-country coordination with key stakeholders, including the national mine action authorities, the UN mine action partners, donors and operators in country, so that there's consistency. That will follow. Number 6, I will leave Elka to expand on that relating to SADDD. Remember that children are defined as those persons below the age of 18 as per the UN Convention on Rights of the Child. Further disaggregation can certainly be made with reference to cultural background and identity, and we would certainly encourage that. Next slide. Lastly, it may be the case that beneficiaries are reported more than once. Sometimes that will happen, possibly with EOR activity and possibly with EOD spot tasks. If that's the case, let's just report it accordingly. That's it from my side. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, colleagues, and over to Elka. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Charles. So yes, we'll pass the floor now to Elke Hottentot of Humanity and Inclusion. Elke is based here in Geneva and, as I say, works with HI as policy lead for armed violence reduction and victim assistance. And she's also, since 2018, been with the UNMAS, working with UNMAS as coordinator for the mine action area of responsibility under the Global Protection Cluster. Elke, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues and friends. Operators engaged in the drafting of this guidance agreed on the principle of collecting data that is disaggregated not only by sex and age, but also by disability. The abbreviation to describe this data, as Charles was just saying, is SADD. So the third D includes an abbreviation for data. So sex, age, disability, disaggregated data. The collaborative decision to collect this data is based on an appreciation of sex, age, and disability as intersecting factors that risk compounding a person's vulnerability and exclusion. The collection of disability disaggregated data is now an international standard, as most of you will know, as per the IASC guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. It's also supported by the Sustainable Development Goals, in short, the SDGs. And whilst the SDGs predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, did not take disability into account and therefore essentially left them unattainable, the SDGs represent a great improvement in this regard. The SDGs can only be achieved if related efforts are disability inclusive. Today, 1/6 of the world population, so this is 1 billion people, live with some form of disability. As a guidance paper by former DFID notes, disability data matters in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. So for the first time in history, people with disabilities are clearly included in a universal and really ambitious plan of action that aims to end poverty and hunger by 2030 and pledges to leave nobody behind. By 2030, we want to live in a world where data has changed the power dynamics between citizens, governments, and organizations that are there to support people most vulnerable. Monitoring progress is critical to the achievement of the SDGs, and to achieve the 2030 agenda, we, the operators, engage in this endeavor of standardizing beneficiary definitions, are committed to not only monitoring, but also designing our programs around putting those who are furthest behind first. To achieve this objective, disaggregated data is essential. And we all seem pretty much clear today as why we're collecting sex and disability and age disaggregated data, namely to ensure that ape dividends benefit women, men, children, adolescents, adults, and elderly alike. Next slide, please, Christina. But how about disability disaggregated? Disability, I think we're all very clear, tends to be a blind spot in the minds of many. Maybe we're not so clear, and that's why we're talking about it, which leaves us with an unconscious bias that leads us to failing into account the realities faced by persons with disabilities. The guidance we are presenting aims to rectify this for the mine action sector. And this is a much needed as of today, as we in the sector are sorely incapable of prioritizing mine action activities on the basis of the impact of explosive ordnance contamination, also on persons with disabilities, who represent 50% of the world population, according to the World Bank, a figure that we know from our experience is mostly higher in countries affected by conflict. A recent study conducted by the Humanitarian Needs Assessment Program for Syria, for example, shows that 27% of Syrians in 2019 were living with a disability, almost double the global average. And as such, when we're conducting a non-technical survey in Syria, saying that persons with disabilities should be amongst the key informants and must participate in focus group discussions. This will allow us to next understand their views and priorities. And without this information, we cannot be accountable to affected populations. Beyond gathering a qualitative understanding of the impact of contamination on a given population, why is it so important to collect disability disaggregated data for the mine action sector? Well, let's just see, for starters, we don't know, for example, who amongst casualties are people with disabilities. Why? Why don't we know that? Because our casualty data is disability blind. While we collect data on the type of injury and disability sustained as a result of an accident, we simply do not know who amongst the casualties was living with a disability prior to having an accident with an explosive ordnance. As such, setting priorities for clearance, for example, does not take into consideration the impact of contamination on persons with disabilities. And our explosive ordnance risk education interventions will not target nor be designed for people living with, for example, functional limitations in mobility or in seeing and hearing. So let's just unpack one example. Imagine you want to design an EOR, explosive ordnance risk education intervention. Perhaps a significantly large proportion of the casualties is comprised of people who are deaf and blind, but we don't know this as the casualty data does not tell us whether this is so. This effectively prevents us from knowing, number one, who's at risk, and makes us wholly unable to design targeted and inclusive interventions that, in this example, take into account people that are visually and hearing impaired. Had disability disaggregated casualty data been available, we would have not only known better who is at risk, but also been able to identify which barriers to equal participation in the education sessions could present and design inclusive interventions. For people that are visually impaired, we would have known that printed materials or visual screen-based interventions were of no good, and that instead audio channels would need to be used to ensure safety messages would also be understood by them. So the collection of sex, age, and disaggregated data work should be our organizational priority, and it now is, as per this guidance, to inform better program design, help to address discrimination and exclusion, and essentially to make sure that the mine action sector contributes to a vision of a world where everybody counts, and to realize on that goal of mine action as an enabler for humanitarian and development and essentially triple nexus outcomes. As such, I hope it is easy to see how collecting this data upstream in the process would help us understand how contamination impacts people with and without disabilities, to next adapt our prioritization and intervention design, and last monitor if persons with disabilities benefit on an equal basis from our intervention. It would be unjust to use the term beneficiaries of EOR without having ensured that the persons with disabilities in the target population were actually able to benefit. And so the 7 operators that work to develop the guidance we are launching today agreed that it is important to disaggregate data by disability in order to understand the different ways in which persons with disabilities experience the impact of contamination, to program in response to these findings in an inclusive manner, and to monitor their access to the dividends of mine action, including access to safe land, livelihoods and services, and of course the development of safer behavior in the face of explosive threat, to name only a few. Next slide, Christina. But how should one collect disability disaggregated data? Globally, there's a growing consensus that the tool to collect this data on people aged 18 years and older is the so-called Washington Group short set of questions. And for children between 2 and 17 years of age, the specific Washington Group module on child functioning. We collectively in the group of mine action operators agree that this tool should be used when gathering data at the individual and household level. Answers to the 6 questions that you see on the screen will generate sound, internationally comparable data that can be collected and disaggregated without discrimination and added quickly and rather inexpensively to censuses and surveys. It is increasingly being used in humanitarian contexts and also the recommended tool in the IS guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. The 6 questions that you see here on the slide cover 6 domains of functioning, namely seeing, hearing, walking, cognition, self-care, and communication. Asking these 6 questions at the individual level and at the level of the household that include a person with a disability will provide data that, if analyzed, and this is really important, can serve to inform priority setting and the design of upstream before implementation. After implementation, so downstream, this data will inform monitoring as to whether our interventions reached a proportionate number of persons with disabilities amongst a given target population. For example, if analysis of a post-impact land survey reveals that only 2% of beneficiaries are persons with disabilities in a protracted crisis, where 20% of the population is disability, then this will hopefully leave the program to scratch its proverbial head and to try to identify how this could be. Could it be that we disproportionately cleared land for or homes of individuals without disabilities who were given more voice during the survey process? Or did our surveyors perhaps not know how to use the Washington Group short set of questions? If the data demonstrates that less than 15% of overall beneficiaries of any intervention have a disability, and this is, as you know by now, a conservative figure, then this means we need to rethink our targeting and monitoring to ensure that our efforts equally benefit all. By asking these 6 Washington Group questions, the data collected will allow us and will assist us with identifying barriers to participation in non-technical survey, explosive ordnance risk education, and also victim assistance, you might be surprised to hear. And it will then enable us to eliminate or reduce these barriers so that persons with disabilities can participate on an equal basis with others. Detailed training materials and resources on the questions that you see on the screen and their use are available on the Washington Group website. By asking these questions and by collecting data that is disaggregated by disability, as well as by sex and age, and analyzing it for the purpose of designing responsive, people-centered programming, we will put the H back in mine action. Remember, we are humanitarian mine action actors and able to make mine action people-centered. So let's go beyond number of instruments and number of items to a really inclusive level of change at the outcome level, which is what we're all aiming for. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Elke. That was really good. We'll be hearing again from Elke a little bit later on when we come on to the victim assistance set of principles. We're now going to move on to hear about the definitions around explosive ordnance risk education. And Sebastian Kazak of MAG is going to talk to us about this. Sebastian joined MAG in 2016 as Senior Community Liaison Advisor. And before that, he has about 20 years of experience elsewhere in the mine action sector with the UN and GICHD and various others. Once we've heard from Sebastian, we'll have the first opportunity for questions. So do put your questions in the chat, or let me know if, by putting your name and your organisation if you have a question. Once we've heard from Sebastian. But in the meantime, Sebastian, it's over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Next slide, please, Christina. I will be speaking about explosive ordnance risk education, one of the 4 technical chapters. And explosive ordnance is the term we started using now. The new IMAS 12.10 has just come out and can be found on the IMAS website. And we have linked this guidance to the new IMAS, quite a revised version. So if you are working on risk education, please consult it. So direct beneficiaries first, the definitions, we group them this time along the 3 main activities. So risk education through interpersonal means, secondly, using mass and digital media, and thirdly, as part of training, and it's training of trainers so that others can deliver risk education as well. We ask people to report separately for each of the 3 categories, because you can imagine if you lump them up, you have very big numbers on mass media, but smaller numbers of interpersonal EORE, and it just doesn't give the right full picture. Indirect beneficiaries, we are saying, of course, yes, they exist. And for example, if someone went to a session and goes home and tells the parents or siblings what he or she learned. So yes, these are indirect beneficiaries, but we say they should not be counted because it's just impossible really to count them and to catch it. And so doesn't tell so much. Next slide, please. Takes time. Okay, so we have a box in the guidance, if you have had a chance to look at it, which explains these 3 core activities in a bit more detail, describes them, gives some examples. And I said it's linked to IMAS. So what we understand, interpersonal risk education is linked to the education part. It's typically under the tree, or if you see the picture from Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan, the sky, the open sky. It can also be in like an institutional briefing in a setting in an office. It can even be now more and more we are working online as an interactive session where people can really talk to each other. So it doesn't have to be our classical thinking of like under the tree. Second one is the public information dissemination. And that's not just mass media, like classically radio, TV, and so on, but also the digital media more and more. And you're well aware of the activities that are ongoing, especially now under the COVID epidemic. The third one, training of trainers. We don't like to just say training because there has been a bit of, these like landmine safety briefings and so on, they're called trainings, the NGO trainings and so on. But what we really think is meant is training of trainers, and all the rest is basically interpersonal education. Next one, please. So what's our guidance on counting and on reporting and so on? So each of the sub-chapters then has this specific guidance after the definition. First of all, Charles already mentioned that double counting may be inevitable. And actually in risk education, it's something what we want. We know that prevention doesn't work with a one-time briefing or session. It needs to be repeated and through different means. So one thing we think is important if we can catch the data is to understand whether we are reaching first-time beneficiaries, especially in situations of like high risk and we want to make sure everyone gets the information quickly. Or let's say we are working through the school system, we want to make sure that all this classes, students are reached. Someone is, yeah, okay. Then on the media, digital mass media, it's especially on the new digital media, it's easier. Yeah, you have clicks, you have user numbers, unique users, and so on. It basically shows you like how many people have opened or have seen this, for example, ad, and that can be the same person 8 times and so on. But we can also see sometimes, are they using the comment function? Are they sharing it? And so on. So we can try to look a bit deeper. We can try to look at the reach also geographically, where people live and come up also with a bit of mapping of our reach. For mass media, it's more complex. And so we basically say you cannot count, but you can estimate. Yeah. And the estimate is using broadcast figures, for radio, for TV and so on. These are usually taken, number of subscribers and so on. But if they are unavailable, then try to come up. Please mute. Hello. I'm trying to mute this person. Out. Mass media estimate, I spoke about that. The problem with mass media figures is that we want to avoid inflation. So for example, if a message is broadcast 3 times over a week, we don't report 3 times the beneficiaries. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's in line with our principles we explained in the beginning. Next one, please. So the training of trainers, usually we're training community focal points, we may train teachers, those outside the mine action sector. Yeah, so they will be the ones for TOT to deliver EORI messaging. These people we would like to ask you to assess for the counting. And then people ask, what about the IEC materials? So our leaflets, posters, and so on, we give out stickers, but even billboards that are set up and so on. We say they should not be counted because it becomes really, how can you say how many people have seen a leaflet and so on? But we see that there may be an exception. And that's if this delivery is like the primary risk education means for if there's an emergency campaign and we can't reach people through other means, that becomes really a key mean for hard to reach populations, then of course we should count them. And I think this is my last slide. So I would like to close. It's not just about counting beneficiaries. We know we want to assess the impact. We want to see if there's a behavior change or not. That's not really covered through defining beneficiaries, but it's the first step. And the better we can report this, then we can also set up monitoring evaluation systems that can look at the different groups and types of beneficiaries, whether they are benefiting or not. Back to Ambassador Aiden, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Sebastian. So as I said earlier, we've got a chance now to ask some questions. I don't actually see any yet in the chat, and so perhaps in the interest of time, we might just push straight on to cover the other three chapters, and then have an opportunity for questions before the next leg of the discussion. So in that case, we will move on to the next chapter, which is land release, and Matthew Todd of Halo, Head of Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning, is going to talk us through this. Matthew, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Can I have my first slide, please? So for land release, this is actually probably the only definition that ties into some embedded in the IMAS, in that the direct beneficiaries of land release are identified under the information management IMAS. So what we're saying here is that the direct beneficiaries are obviously those people who are going to physically use the land. And that we see that the whole of the household of those people who are physically using the land should be counted. So the women, the girls, the boys and the men, all the individuals involved in the physical use of the land are the people that we should count. For indirect beneficiaries, those are people who are going to benefit from the use of the land in other ways. It's not that they themselves use the land, but because the land comes into use, things change in their community. It may be that there are, because there's more land available for agriculture, that there's more agricultural produce available, and that then affects what they can access, and that improves their food security. So we're looking at the use of the community group as a whole as being the indirect beneficiaries. So to take the population count for the administrative unit that the particular land release task is found in as being the number of people that we should count for the indirect beneficiaries. Next slide, please. And in general, what we believe is that we're looking at how people benefit because things have changed. So when we're releasing land, one aspect of land release is cancellation, and usually that means that we have found that there is no evidence of any contamination in the particular area of land, and people are already using it. So when we've gone and we've done our non-technical survey, we've identified areas of land that were suspected originally, but when we go and do our investigation, we discover that they're already being used. People have been using them for some time in many cases. And so really nothing is changing by us cancelling that area. It's a database management exercise. It's an information management exercise that benefits the operators and the national authority in terms of knowing where there is still contamination to be addressed, but it doesn't really change anything for people themselves. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and we will allow counting of beneficiaries where it is clear that land use is going to come about as a result of that cancellation process, and certain other circumstances where it is clear that we can identify and document what those benefits are to actually changing that status. But in general, what we're talking about really is land that is released through a technical process, through clearance and through technical survey, where there is clear evidence that the land was contaminated. So we've identified 6 land use categories, and I want to just kind of illustrate as we look at those land use categories, we believe this encompasses all aspects of land use, and that there shouldn't really be any areas that we're clearing that don't fall under one of these 6 categories. But I want to kind of illustrate how important it is for indirect beneficiaries as well as the direct beneficiaries. When, as I said, we have more land in use for agriculture, that means that there is more produce available in local markets. It might mean that there's a greater amount of crop diversification because the farmers are able to actually use more land and use it in more diverse ways, which means in turn that there is improved food security. And that affects the whole of the population because they're all able to access the benefit of that agricultural output. When we have more land available for residential purposes, it means there is more safe housing. It makes it easier for IDPs and refugees to return to areas that have been contaminated, and that it allows them to start rebuilding their lives and their livelihoods. More land available for community and public service use means that there are more factories, more shops, there's more availability of employment, more jobs, and that means that you have more vibrant local economies. It also means there's more access to education, more access to health services, and we see the general level of livelihood and improve for the community as a whole. When there's more land available for natural resource use, it means that communities have safer access to water. It means that they can that land can be used by individuals and communities for fishing, for foraging, for hunting, for collecting materials, forest materials that they might need on a regular basis. It means that they can engage in more extensive grazing of their animals, and that means that farmers and in rural communities may invest more in livestock, and that means that there is again improved food security for those communities. More land for small and medium scale local infrastructure leads to better access to electricity, to water, to telecoms. So we see all of these things lead to improvements in lifestyle for the affected communities. And more land released for access, as we clear pathways and roads and bridges, means that land beyond the areas that we clear also becomes available for use, and it's a multiplier which leads to greater land use beyond just the areas that we have worked as mine action operators. And for now, that's to say. So I'll pass you back to the Ambassador. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Matthew. And we're getting a few questions in on this, which is great. So we'll come back to them at the end of this this section. So now we're going to go back to Elke to cover the victim assistance chapter. Elke.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm just waiting to see the slide that's going to come up, which is slide number 18, please. So in February of this year, the IMAS Review Board adopted IMAS 1310 on victim assistance, which confirms that the mine action sector has a role to play in victim assistance, even when not receiving so-called victim assistance earmarked funding, meaning that when we are conducting explosive ordnance risk education, community liaison, clearance survey, as seen on the slide here, that is up. You can see here HI using, did I remove that picture? Hold on, let's see. Picture's no longer there, but you see different mine action activities being carried out. And the IMAS 13 then now confirms that we have a role to play in contributing to victim assistance. I'll explain that a little bit further later. IMAS 1310 describes the roles and responsibilities of 5 different actors. It's national mine action authorities, national mine action centers, operators, donors, and survivor organizations. Now, the activities that are described in IMAS 1310 are referred to as victim assistance specific efforts. Now, of course, it needs to be said that certain operators, and HI is one of them, also engage in the delivery of so-called victim assistance services, whether rehabilitation or mental health and psychosocial support, either directly or through implementing partners. Most operators don't do this, though. And IMAS 1310 now makes the responsibility for all actors in the mine action sector to contribute to facilitating access to services for people that are critically injured by explosive ordnance, survivors, other persons with disabilities, and indirect victims. You may wonder how the mine action sector can do this, even if it's not, or particularly when it's not delivering services. This is possible through what I was just describing are the VA-specific efforts, and there's 4 of those. One thing we've always done, which is collecting casualty data, which we have mostly used to inform where we should clear or who we should target for explosive ordnance risk education activities. But we have less used this data, less analyzed it, to have an understanding of what situation is faced by people that are injured or whether they have access to services. And so the sector already collects this data, but hasn't really been asked to analyze it for the purpose of victim assistance. IMAS 13 changes this. IMAS 13 will also be seeing a small amendment in February, where the sector will also be asked to collect not only data on casualties, but also on services in the area of operations, so services that are relevant for people injured, survivors, and indirect victims. The sector now is also asked to contribute to referring people to services on the basis of A, their access to survivors, and B, their understanding of services in a given area. The sector is also now asked to share information and promote and monitor a multi-sector engagement. Well, what does that mean? That's a lot of words. For example, this means if we were to analyze casualty data and find that the mortality rate is unusually high in an area where district health authorities do not have an adequate emergency medical response, we shall, as per IMAS 1310, now communicate our insights on the basis of the data, of course, with respect for data protection regulation, to the Ministry of Health and other service providers in an effort to promote the delivery of these much needed life-saving services and see an actual reduction in the mortality rate of casualties. And last, the mine action sector should, on the basis of their knowledge of people injured by explosive ordnance contamination, survivors and affected family members, and communities, also support the development of national action plans, coordination mechanism, and use their understanding of the situation faced by victims to mobilize resources. So this is, in short, le devoir, the homework, the TOR, that will be added to those of community liaison workers, of clearance actors, of EOR providers, as part of their regular job, that they should carry out these efforts without actually receiving extra funding for it. This is just a quick introduction to IMAS 1310. Why? Because we decided, of course, now that we have this IMAS, that it made sense to also come up with a definition of the beneficiaries of these specific victim assistance efforts. Can I ask you to go to the next slide? Thank you. Christina, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So together we agreed that the beneficiaries of specific victim assistance efforts can be both direct and indirect. Direct beneficiaries are persons who are identified and revert to services, or for whom emergency medical transport is provided in the absence of other actors, are able to do that. And if an operator also delivers services, such as MHPSS or rehab, those who benefit from those services. Now, of course, as per the principle of non-discrimination that guides victim assistance, direct beneficiaries may also include other people presenting with similar needs. And the victim assistance specific efforts also have so-called indirect beneficiaries. These are defined as persons who either live in the same household as a direct beneficiary at the time the services, we're here referring to MHPSS, rehab, any kind of direct victim assistance service. For example, indirect beneficiaries are the children of a man who has received mental health and psychological support or a prosthetic leg. Indirect beneficiary are also people who have been identified as per IMAS 1310 and had their information shared with organizations providing services in the sector that victim assistance is a part of. So for example, if we find that a great number of people are in psychological distress, as HI is finding in Syria, in areas with really high levels of contamination, it is now our responsibility as a sector to communicate this understanding to actors that can provide much needed mental health and psychological support services. The number of people for who we share information are counted as indirect beneficiaries. Now, these examples should demonstrate how the mine action sector has an important role to play in facilitating access to services. All the more as we have, and I can only really call this privileged access to casualty data and privileged understanding of the needs people face. Because we're often the only organizations working in these hard to reach areas, whether because they're remote and rural or because they're heavily contaminated in urban settings. So it seems only logical that we would put our insights to good use and ensure people in need are aware of existing services, and that we would support them, but also by mobilizing a multi-sector response to be able to access these much needed services. So that is a quick explanation of how we would count beneficiaries of victim assistance when we do our risk education, community liaison, clearance work. Any questions? We're here. Over to you, dear Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Elke. So we'll now move on to the final chapter, and we'll have a round of Q&A after this presentation before we move on to the second part. So the last one is explosive ordnance disposal, and Alex Van Roy is going to talk us through this. Alex is the Deputy Head of Operations at the Swiss Federation of Mine Action. He was 17 years an Australian Army officer and has been in the humanitarian mine action sector since 1999. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Ambassador. Just a short presentation on the explosive ordnance disposal side of the guidance. It's important to remember that an EOD spot task is not actually a land release activity. It's more a risk reduction activity. And in a particular community, there may be many of these EOD spot tasks, and even after a number have been completed, there may still be a residual risk. We have looked at counting beneficiaries in a number of ways, and it's important to remember that we are talking about a per task calculation, not per item of explosive ordnance. So there are two categories of direct beneficiaries. The first one is the person actually reporting the item of explosive ordnance and their immediate household, and or persons regularly using the physical asset that may be blocked by an item of explosive ordnance. Now, what we mean by physical asset, it could be a school, a medical clinic, the local water supply, or something like that. Indirect beneficiaries, we look at the household members of beneficiaries, particularly those identified in the second definition, and those requiring evacuation for the task. Now, some beneficiaries may benefit from more than one task, but obviously total beneficiary numbers should not exceed the local population. Now, the source of the data used to derive the beneficiary figures should be mentioned, be it a census or a key informant like a local village leader or someone similar. And if we wish, we can use the land use categories mentioned in the land release guidelines section to further describe the impact of the work. Ambassador, that's all I have to say.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Alex. So we've run through the four chapters now, as well as hearing earlier on about the overall purpose and principles and some of the insights, particularly on disability data. So we've got a chance now for a quick discussion on that before we move on to the second part of our discussion, which is going to be hearing feedback from national mine action authorities and from others involved in which I'm looking forward to. I guess, I mean, there's a few questions coming in on the chat, but I mean, I think there is the theme that I'm sort of picking out to begin with is this question around indirect and direct beneficiaries. I mean, beneficiaries, I think, as Elke was saying earlier, is itself a slightly loaded term. So it might be interesting to hear the views of our panel on that term, although it's obviously a very standard one in the sector. But this question of direct and indirect beneficiaries, how we draw the line, whether we measure indirect beneficiaries at all, or only in the absence of more direct figures. In particular, we've got a couple of specific questions around the risk education chapter. That question again on direct and indirect beneficiaries. A specific question from Bikram Mahapatra about vehicle awareness, whether that counts as direct or indirect. And I think particularly in risk education, the indirect measure, obviously, if you're talking about mass media consumption, that's as Matthew mentioned, as Sebastian mentioned, that's obviously a much bigger cohort than the direct one. And so the question about vehicle awareness would be good to pick up. And then on land release, Fazil Rahim asked about people living in the buffer zones around mined areas. You know, are they direct or indirect beneficiaries? And there was a question from Ijaz Khan, which I think has been answered, about marking and fencing as well. So perhaps before we get into some more questions, perhaps some general reflections from our panelists around that direct indirect quandary. Sebastian, do you want to take that first?
Sure, pleasure. Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, for the risk education, we said, let's not get into the problem of indirect beneficiaries. And so we were suggesting to just not report indirect. And the logic is, if you have like the classic sending a message, receiving a message. So we are sending a message, but sometimes we just don't know, are people listening to the radio or not? But they could have. So sometimes we can actually count, and other times we have to estimate. And that's what the TV does as well. I mean, they are checking how many people are on average, you know, looking at this show and compared to other shows and so on. So for us, it's not only counting. That's why I said the map is also important. So let's have a reach as well. Try to see, are we reaching the people that need it? And sometimes overreaching, yeah. If we don't want to spread panic into an area where there is no threat from explosive ordnance. So the messaging, especially through the media, needs to be quite precise and considered carefully. And I can take this up. There was another question also about the EORE and using like campaigns. And I would just like to remind us of the principle not to inflate figures. So if it's repeated, let's say 1 week, next week, and so on, we are still reaching the same people. If we use the same radio or some different radio stations, they may even have overlapping, of course, areas. We just need to be as realistic as possible. And we say in this context, please sit together also with other agencies that may use the same efforts, come up with a system that you think is fair, that can be explained, and that's it. We just don't want people to inflate figures and make up stories that are not believable. And the vehicle, before I hand over or hand back, that's a bit tricky. We have people with megaphone going around and so on, and then you can say, of course, everyone in the village will have heard it. So we have an age bracket. We say only count people from 6 and above. And I know FSD has done a brave project in Ukraine with children under, I think, with 2, 3, 4 years old. These are exceptions. So the average we should count from 6 and above. And yes, then it can only be an estimate. We can't count everyone on a vehicle going around, but you can say the population in this village area we covered the total is X. but we subtract the figure of those under 6. Thank you, and back to Ambassador.
Thank you. And I suppose this is something that we see across the board, isn't it? That almost by definition, we can be far more precise with direct beneficiaries than perhaps we can with indirects, and so we have to be aware of the different sort of qualities of data that we're collecting. Matthew, I want to give you a chance to come in on that, particularly because there was a couple of specific questions on the land release definitions, but any general reflections on that as well, of course, would be very welcome. Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. I think the key thing that we've said in this definition, and it's consistent also with the definition that's in the IMAS 510 on information management, is that the direct beneficiaries are the people who will physically use the land. They either are physically using the land or they have the intention to physically use the land. They're the people whose lives and limbs are being saved by the removal of the explosive ordnance. And so the link is very clear between the activities that we carry out in land release and actually their use of the land and the protection that provides to them. But as I said in my presentation, the things that follow on from that, the greater access to land for use for agriculture, the greater access to health services and community space, the general improvement in the economy, that benefits everybody in the community around that. And ultimately, as you move further and further away in time from the point where you made the physical intervention on the land, it's that community benefit that you see rather than the individual benefit for those families that are actually affected by the use of that particular small area that might have been mined in the first place. So I think it would be wrong to not count the indirect beneficiaries because over an extended period of time, the benefit is for all of that community. And we've seen around the world in all sorts of different places that the land use increases beyond the areas that we clear. In Colombia, we've seen coffee plantations where we've cleared a narrow strip of land that provides access for the farmers to that particular area. And then a huge coffee plantation has been come up in the 4, 5, 6 years subsequent after we've done that particular clearance. In Sri Lanka, we can see very clearly just by looking at satellite imagery in some cases where Halo cleared a strip of land that was blocking access for a village to some residential area and some agricultural area. And then the size of land that was occupied for housing went way beyond the area that we'd cleared because the community could now access those other areas of land as well that were blocked by that minefield. So again and again, what we see is that it's the wider community benefit is in some ways much greater over a period of time than just the benefit that applies to the direct beneficiaries who use the land. But obviously, those people in the immediate short term are having their limbs saved, their lives saved in many cases, and we want to identify them very clearly as well. I hope that answers.
Great, thank you. I'll take one or two more questions now, and then we'll move on to the next section of the discussion. Can I give the floor to Maisa Hajjaj of MAG? She's got a specific question around beneficiaries and interventions. Maisa, I think you can probably ask the question better than I can, so I'll hand the floor to you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So my question was basically that it's fantastic that we will have a standardized method and mediums to calculate the beneficiaries, especially for people with special needs. But my concern is how we can then have a mutual or parallel approach into the interventions that we provide, especially true for the risk education activities, and also the mediums that we use to deliver these activities.
Thanks. Who'd like to take that? Sebastian?
Yeah, I just think it's like we said, we can only do like the working group short set in household settings and individual interviews and so on. So for the usual risk education session I mentioned under the tree, it doesn't work. And so it's, for me, it really goes more into the direction Maisa was saying for the programming. Let's make sure that risk education reaches persons with disabilities. Yeah. And adapt our interventions and make sure, as Elke said, that we use the right materials and approaches, and we can document that and report on that. And I think that's, for me, how to address it for the specific part of risk education. Elke raised her hand.
Yeah, please, Elke, come in on that.
Thank you, and thank you, Maisa, for your question. In addition to what Sebastian just said, I really think we need to start asking the question when we collect casualty data. We need to ask the Washington Group set of questions to casualties. So that means we would simply add a category where we can tick off one of those 6 or more than one of those 6 boxes. So we know if somebody was hearing or visually impaired or had functional limitations in walking or had cognitive challenges. Because today we are completely disability blind with our casualty data. So we can't base our intervention in any kind of smart way because we just simply lack the understanding of who is actually at risk. Is that a proportionally high number of persons with disability?
Elke, sorry to interrupt, but you are muted. Can you please unmute yourself? Thanks.
How did that happen? Where did I lose you?
Just the last couple of seconds, really. Yeah.
Okay. So the single biggest message that I would like to pass is start including the Washington Group set of questions when you collect data on casualties, and then you can make an informed decision of how and who you should target. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Now there's a couple of specific questions in on the chat from Yulia and from Angelo, which I might leave our panelists to answer in writing, perhaps on the chat, because I'd like to move on to the next section of the conversation, which is to get feedback from some of the other practitioners in the field, and particularly from some of our colleagues in mine action authorities. So first of all, I'm going to give the floor to the Deputy Secretary General of the Cambodian Mine Action Authority, Lee Panarit. And Your Excellency, I'm very pleased that you were able to join us today, and I'll hand the floor to you. You'll need to unmute your device. There we are. The floor's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador and colleagues, good afternoon from Cambodia. First, I would like to thank the 7 organizations at this event, and congratulations, great team who developed an edition for this beneficiary definitions. In the context of mine action in Cambodia, the Cambodian Mine Action Authority works with Ministry of Interior, which is in charge of subnational development and all administrative units, including the mine action planning units, known as MAPU. MAPU is the prime actor in mine action planning and prioritization in each province and municipality. Categories of beneficiary is one of the criteria for planning and prioritization, which ensures the accurate allocation of mine action resources and right impact on the communities. Therefore, consistency in defining the beneficiary is of utmost significance. At the international level, we report the implementation of our obligations to some conventions, such as the Anti-Personnel Mine Convention and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. At the national level, we report to the Ministry of Planning, who is in charge of overall report on progress of Cambodia's Sustainable Development Goals. For those colleagues who are new to Cambodian context, please note that mine action is under Goal 18 of the Cambodia's Sustainable Development Goals. Apparently, it is a common practice that at international and national level, beneficiary is part of the evaluations for mine action achievements. How important is it for mine action in Cambodia to standardize the beneficiary definitions? I think you know the answer. I haven't yet mentioned about the collaboration with mine action organizations and donors. We have been working together for many years to ensure beneficiary data comparability in our national database. Of course, there are improvements from time to time, but there are also different challenges in different phases. As such, only with standardization that we can eliminate ambiguity and guarantee quality in planning and prioritization, reporting and evaluation. Dear colleagues, while in general we support the concept of standardization of beneficiary definitions, a lot of work remains to be done. We always adopt the inclusive and participatory approach when it comes to the issues like this. So, comprehensive consultation with key stakeholders in Cambodia, including local communities, needs to be done. For the next step, we will determine the platform to do it. Meanwhile, it we may that the developers of this document should provide focal points to need clarification and support. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Director General. Very good to hear the perspective from Cambodia. And I'd now like to hand over to Angola. Dr. Gonçalves of the Angolan National Mine Action Authority. It's very good to see you again, sir, and looking forward to hearing your reflections.
If you could just...
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. First, I would like to thank to the organizer for inviting me at this important virtual event in this challenging time. The standardization of the beneficiaries definition for humanitarian mine action provide an opportunity and platform for the general mine action sector in having a common voice and language in the interpretation of mine action work. Uniformity of this definition not only enforce a coherent voice, but also ensure that the rightful beneficiary to mine action activity are correctly identified and targeted. This in itself a better target-oriented approach to mine action work. Besides the uniformity, adoption of this term also has an extended value addition to proper utilization of resource for the right target group. As always indicated, the government of Angola gives particular importance to its international obligation under the Mine Ban Treaty. Acknowledging the tremendous work that has been achieved over the recent years with the review and development of the International Mine Action Standard, an addition of the standard beneficiaries definition only reinforces their importance. This, in turn, will also ensure that national programs like Angola align their national and operating procedures, hence improving reporting and accountability. For a long time, it should be recalled that the failure to having a common understanding on the definition of beneficiary within the mine action sector has either led to a wrong target
It appears we've
or even wrong group.
Dr. Gonsalves, we just lost the feed for a minute there. Can you still hear us? I think we've lost Dr. Gonsalves. Let's while we're trying to get the feedback, perhaps we should we'll move on to the next speaker. So I'll give the floor now to Tammy Hall of the Geneva International Centre for Humanitarian Demining. Tammy, hold the line a second. I think Dr. Gonsalves is back.
No problem.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. First, I would like to thank to the organizer for inviting me at this important virtual event in this challenging time. The standardization of the beneficiary definition for humanitarian mine action provide an opportunity and platform for the general mine action sector in having a common voice and language in the interpretation of mine action work. And uniformity of this definition not only enforce a coherent voice, but also ensure that the rightful beneficiary to mine action activity are correctly identified and targeted. This is in itself creates a better target-oriented approach to mine action work. Beside the uniformity, adoption of this term also has an extended value addition to proper utilization of resource for a rightful target group. As always indicated, the government of Angola gives particular importance to its international obligation under the Mine Ban Convention. Acknowledging the tremendous work that has been achieved over the recent years with the review and development of the international mine action standard and the addition of the standard beneficiaries definition only reinforce their importance. This in turn will also ensure that the national program like Angola align their national and operating procedures, hence improving reporting and accountability. For a long time, it should be recalled that the failure to having a common understanding on the definition of a beneficiary within the mine action sector has either led to wrong target group benefiting from intervention or even wrong group being registered as beneficiaries. With the continued call by government to link mine action activity to national development plan, this definition provides a timely opportunity for mine action implementing country to ensure that their development plan are well aligned with the right beneficiaries, hence having a more sustained impact of our outcome. With this, I would like to categorically emphasize that Angola Mine Action Program, through a stewardship of CNIDA, will ensure that these definitions are adopted and implemented in all mine action activity in the country. In the same voice, I call upon all actors in the mine action sector around the world to prioritize their adoption of this definition to ensure better impact of our noble work and to the right beneficiary. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Gonsalves. Muito obrigado. I would like now to hand the floor to Tammy Hall. Tammy is the head of the Strategies and Standards Division at GICHD, and before that was at the Danish Demining Group. So I guess you were involved in the first edition of this back in 2016 from DGG. Oh no, that was before DGG got involved, I think, wasn't it? But anyway, as at GICHD, you're obviously very heavily involved in IMAS, and as I was saying at the beginning, the ambition now is for this definitional work to move into the IMAS sphere. So it's great that we're able to hear from you about that process. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and hello to everyone who's tuning in from different time zones. I'm just going to try and share my screen here, so please bear with me. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So just shout if you cannot. I'll assume you can. Well, we've had a lot of very interesting presentations today, and so I won't keep this. I will keep this fairly short. We've had lots of information. I would like to start off though by saying how pleased the GICHD was to be asked to participate in this event, but also to participate in the initiative of finding of a 2.0 version of the standardized beneficiaries document. We think this is a big step forward. We especially appreciate the efforts to make this version much more inclusive, and I think it's led to a much better document. We do see this document as covering ground that is so important, however, that as the ambassador has just said, we should consider bringing this guidance into IMAS. It certainly represents important guidance for the sector, and through the IMAS, it can be made yet more relevant to all members of the sector. So, what is in IMAS now about beneficiaries? I had some interesting research when I was involved in looking at this document. And what I found was there was fairly limited guidance on beneficiaries if you look at the ensemble of the framework. If we look through the documents, we can see that there's an evolution in the sense that in general, newer IMAS refer more to beneficiaries than older ones, although it does depend on the theme. One thing that I found quite interesting was that there, within the of IMAS 410, which is our standardized look at terminology, there is no definition for beneficiary in there. I think part of this stems from the fact that it was felt that beneficiary shouldn't be defined by a mine action organization because it goes beyond mine action. But at the same time, I think it is notable that we haven't chosen to define it within the context of the sector. So let's look at what we might consider. We've had a lot of presentations on what's in this document, and it refers to a number of different areas of mine action. The IMAS on land release 711 doesn't really refer to beneficiaries specifically and the way we count them. That's interesting in and of itself, I think. Nor does the EUD IMAS 930. Where we start to get more relevant to beneficiaries is perhaps obviously when we start talking about risk education, which talks a lot about beneficiaries, and we'll come back to that later. A much newer addition to the IMAS was the annex on defining on minimum data requirements that is attached to IMAS 510 on information management. And that really is the place that we have dealt with this question within the IMAS guidance. And I think that's where we will certainly come back to. Obviously, evaluations and impact are a key element in terms of beneficiaries. And I think that will be also, that is something that I will highlight later, but there certainly is some talk of beneficiaries in there, but none of the very detailed counting information and reporting type of guidance that you see in this document that we're launching today. We also have obviously some relevant references to beneficiaries in victim assistance. That is still in draft, and we hope it will be approved shortly, but that is a new IMAS. Just coming back to impact a bit, the GICHD recently authored with the UNDP together called Leaving No One Behind, Mine Action and the Sustainable Development Goals, that looks at a number of areas of where Mine Action supports the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think a lot of these areas relate to finding common counting rules and measurement for how Mine Action is affecting beneficiaries. They note that there's a need to promote mainstreaming of Mine Action into broader sustainable development. I feel that that is related to this issue of beneficiaries. They look at the importance of SDG compatible outcomes. Of course, this kind of outcome reporting, information on beneficiaries are germane to being able to measure outcomes properly. And looking at monitoring livelihoods, peace building, and development investments, all those areas are germane to us looking at how Mine Action affects the SDGs, and looking at this issue of beneficiaries will also feed into that, I believe. And of course, you know, looking at collecting and analyzing data and being able to disaggregate it as much as possible allows us to bring a greater complexity to our analysis. And as we know, analyzing outcomes is a complex business. So what might we look at in terms of possible ways ahead for the content of this document in IMAS? Well, we could look at proposing some amendments to the existing documents that are in IMAS. Things like adding definitions to IMAS 410. I think the most important one would be probably this Annex B to IMAS 510. Looking at land release, we could possibly put references here that might be relevant. And the same would be 930. I suppose I didn't put that in, but looking at evaluation again, and of course the victim assistance, which is a draft so far. But I think there is also the scope for proposing that there would be a technical note that mirrors a lot of the content of this document. Technical notes are meant to inform on methodologies. They tend to be more complex in nature and not putting out the same type of standardization guidelines. But they're very vital for people understanding how to go about the business of implementing standards. And I think that it would certainly be an interesting thing to consider a technical note with this content. And then looking at maybe additional criteria for impact reporting that may be based on some of the groundwork that's done in this document. If the sector wants to move forward, and obviously that is our position, that this would be the way ahead. It's not such a difficult process. There is obviously a justification and proposal from the Mine Action community, and almost all the authors of this document are represented on the IMAS Review Board, which is the technical body that reviews new IMAS guidance. So that would be an easy matter. These proposals are initially reviewed by the IMAS Review Board Chair and Secretary, and then submitted to the board for acceptance in terms of working on the content with Review Board members and developing that content. You only need 25% of positive votes inside the IMAS Review Board to actually start the process of initiating new content, which doesn't mean that it will necessarily be accepted, but that you can start the process of discussing it. And obviously, a lot of the content we're seeing here is very mature, so one would imagine that that process would be very much shorter, and the discussion about what is required inside IMAS would be all the richer from the get-go. I think I would like to stop here and thank you, the ambassador, for handing me the floor. But perhaps I will just stop here and see if there are any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Tammy. That's really useful to hear about the process and how we might take this forward. So we're almost out of time, but I do just want to give an opportunity to our audience to ask any questions. I was particularly struck by what Dr. Gonçalves and Mr. Panarit said about integrating about the benefit of having these standardized definitions for reporting back into the rest of government about how mine action supports national development plans. I think that was really persuasive. As I said earlier, from the point of view of a donor, I think there's a real interest in having a sort of a good quality metric to be able to justify our own investment and show the benefits of our own investment in this area. So I think from both ends and indeed from the sector itself, in having that one standard of information, there is really clear benefits to this framework, and I think we've had a really good go through what the individual definitions will mean as well. There's obviously still a lot to work on. Some of the questions in the chat have been really interesting about some of the grey areas that will always exist in an exercise like this. But of course, this really does show the level of interest, I think, in this exercise. So before we close, then I'd like to just give the opportunity to our audience to ask any questions or to make any final comments. I see Louis Maresca has asked for the floor. Louis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Lou Maresca from the International Committee of the Red Cross. I just wanted to take a moment here at the end to really, first of all, thank the organizations that are behind this development. It's certainly an important one that has seen a number of key advancements this year with regard to standards, of course. There's the new IMAX risk education that has been adopted, the work that's going on victim assistance, and for us, this kind of is another important advancement in the work of humanitarian mine action. Also like to thank the presenters. A lot of the messages and issues that were raised were extremely helpful and substantive, and I think made this a really fruitful event. The ICRC was very pleased to participate in the process that led to the development of this new edition of the beneficiary definitions. We did so with two of our regional managers from the field who participated. We're very pleased with the result and have been promoting their use among our risk education, risk awareness and safer behavior programs in the field. I'd just like to support the comments and observations that were made in Tammy's presentation. I think there is a definite need and importance in kind of dovetailing these definitions, these beneficiary definitions, because as she pointed out, they really kind of underlie either explicitly or implicitly many of the IMAS standards that already exist. So we sit on the IMAS review board as an observer, but certainly look forward to contributing to that effort in the times to come. So thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Louis. I'll give the floor now to Thomas Remberdal.
Yeah, hi, hello, and thank you very much, Ambassador. And thanks a lot for this event and for your very interesting presentations. I've been listening very carefully. I will be brief, but I just wanted to, on behalf of Norway, congratulate you on finalizing and launching the second edition of this important and very useful document. I want you to know that you are building confidence among the donors, at least with Norway, when you are proving that 7 influent mine action operators have come together in this important exercise by developing common principles, standards and definitions. So in the ministry in Oslo, we receive and read the reports of all your good activities and project implementation. And reached goals and realized achievements is what we look for in your reports. And I am certain that your reporting will be even more reliable and exact after this second edition finalized. So Norway is a proud donor to this sector, and we just want to encourage you to keep up the good and vital work that you do all over the world. So by that, thank you very much from Oslo.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good to hear from Oslo. Next on my list, I have Christelle Lupforest from UNMAS. Christelle, nice to hear from you.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be part of this launch. I'm sorry I missed the first half an hour, but I really wanted to participate. And I have 3 points. One is that as the Deputy Global Coordinator of Action Area Responsibility, I would say that I have supported this process very warmly, and actually we even hosted one of the consultation in February before the last NDM at Villa Bocage. The second thing I wanted to say is that if you look at the humanitarian response planning work that's happening in 16 countries where we have mine action coordination mechanism, there is a big pressure from all our partners, from OCHA, from the other clusters, for us to define what are the people in need we should be targeting. Because as you know, there's not enough money, not enough resources to handle all the humanitarian needs. So we're under pressure to really target who is it, who are the people who are most in need of mine action. And we have been developing indicators to facilitate this work by our mine action AOR coordinators in the field, working with, of course, all the mine action NGOs and partners. But this work is not finalized, and we need to complete it. And of course, what we want is to come also to having some kind of a common methodology to define who are the people who are most in need of mine action and that we should be targeting, and so that we can coordinate our work and make sure that those who really need it the most in terms of protection are getting the assistance they need. My second point is that I was, as coordinator, you like to aggregate data and see what are the trends. So I was looking at what did we ask in the 16 humanitarian response plan this year. And for mine action in those 16 plans for 2020, we were planning to help 20 million people. So we had 20 million people in need of mine action targeted. And I've asked the coordinator recently, how many have you reached? And according to the data they gave me, we have reached 5 million through this humanitarian response plan effort. So of course, you're thinking, why only 5 million out of 20 million? So I think the reasons are: 1, lack of funding; 2, lack of access or security situation; 3, COVID-19, which has also slowed down our capacity to deliver. But another possibility is also that, the methodology to assess, the beneficiaries was not consistent. And there I come to this standardized definition. I think this will help us sharpen this capacity to say how many people have we reached in the future. So I look forward to working with Sebastian, Matthew, and all the other colleagues who have developed this wonderful piece of work to define that methodology on who are the people in need and who we target. And with this, I thank everybody for their attention, and I give you back the floor. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Christelle. Very good to hear from you. I'm going to close the list of speakers now. Finally and briefly, please, Werner Hofs, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks to everyone for the presentations. My name is Werner. I'm the UNICEF Mine Action focal point for Menaro, the MENA region. So it's not a question per se, but just wanted to add on to what has already been said. And we think that this is extremely interesting guidelines and definitely a step in the right direction. As UNICEF, the UN, I mean, it's already been stated, but we still have to follow the IMAS. But this is definitely will definitely open up the debate in terms of improving transparency, harmonization, avoiding double counting. All of these things have already been said. So yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, for this. And like Christelle just said, hope to work with you all in the future so that we can use this as an inspiration to improve the IMAS and all of the common frameworks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Werner. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. The fact that we've still got over 100 people on the line and lots of questions in the chat means that we could probably have gone on even longer, but we're out of time, I regret to say. We're getting a lot of questions in asking us to share the presentations and particularly to share them in French and other languages. As we said at the top of the discussion, the work of translating these is certainly ongoing and obviously will continue. So I'm sure we can circulate what we've got as well as circulating the presentations from today. I don't know if Sebastian, you want a final word? I can see you on my screen.
No, I'm really happy about the good turnout and the interesting presentations by all, and apologies for speaking too long. It's always ambitious to stick to 5 minutes. But really, as seeing the interest in the sector, I think it's an important piece, and we will move forward with all of you in many countries we're working on across the world. And so thanks for the attention, and looking forward to the cooperation. And thank you, Ambassador, for chairing this event.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Really a privilege, and this is great work. And I think we can see from the discussion today how much interest there is. So with that, thank you all very much indeed for dialing in. Thank you to our excellent presenters. Thanks to everybody who's been involved in this work, either in drafting it, in consulting it, in giving their feedback. This really is, as I said, a collaborative effort, and I think collaboration and inclusion is a hallmark of this sector, and I think this is a really good example of it. So thank you all very much indeed, and have a great day. Bye.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador.